Ariel Kabeh, which I find a personally very fun topic. But I think before we delve into that, because a lot of the discussions today are going to touch at least a little bit on some other um, categories of foods that are not batel, right? Right now, we're sort of within this range of talking about, after talking about the normal form of bitul free storim, these couple simanim are really talking about what are the exceptions to that case, right? Like what are the scenarios in which something is not batel at all? And so we've seen at least one or two of them. A couple of them we have not seen inside, but have been referenced at least in the material for today. So what are some of the categories of things that are not batel? Reuven?
I think one of them is davar sheyesh lo matirin.
Correct. That is next Siman. Davar sheyesh lo matirin, which is what?
Um, I don't have a good grasp of it, but my understanding is it's something that it's not like an egg laid on Yom Tov. It's not permitted now, but it will be permitted in the near future. And for a reason I do not grasp, that means that lo batil we are very stringent.
Yes, the egg is like the paradigmatic case, right? The like Beit Shnol Yantif. As soon as it's not Yantif, like it's not like treif or anything, it's just mukta on Yantif. So that's our one of our paradigmatic cases of Devar Sheish Lamatsirin. Probably when we do that inside, there's a really excellent Ron that
Yeah.
Malcolm, are you going to be teaching
Yes,
that?
we'll see the Ron. Yes.
Great. There's a really great run that I think gets into some of the interesting conceptual breakdowns of like why Divarshi Ishlamatirin would be more stringent and also why, as we'll see, the rule is different when it's mim b'mino versus mim b'she'eno mino. So that's one of them. Amazing. What are other Eno Batel categories? Max?
Davar Shabaminion, something that uh, I guess that you buy when you buy it, you buy a certain number of them.
Right. This is something that's going to be very relevant in part of our Siman today is the question of how like what happens if a particular thing maybe falls in multiple categories? Is it possible that something could be not significant enough or not qualify for one of these categories, but still not be bought out because of one of
Can you
the
read me a
others?
different one?
Huh? Oh, no. So that will come up
Right
in
over
part of our
there.
material today. Um, and we do see also there's a debate within that question of Devar Minyan of whether it's Kol Shadar Kolim Not or Et Shadar Kolim Not, which means is it anything that is like often or sometimes sold by number, or is it only things that are exclusively sold by number? Right? The etch their kalim note is like specifically, this is never sold by weight or by general whatever. It's only ever sold by numbers. And so that obviously leads to a slightly more limited definition. Okay, so we have Devar Sheish Matirin, Devar Sheish Minyan. What's another?
Here, yeah.
Exactly. Birya. Right, our little creatures that we covered last time. So we'll see also throughout a lot of these commentaries, a lot of the Nosei Kalim and the Machaber are often trying to put these categories in conversation with each other, right? That since these are all categories of things that are not Batel, there's some extent to which we like learn their rules from one another, in which we assume that rules that apply to one apply to the other. But we'll see that there are also a handful of cases where because the rationale for why a thing is not Batel in these cases is a bit different between them, there are cases where that there might be nafkaminas, where that might lead to a different ruling. Okay. So today, though, we have um Chatifa Haryalit Kabed, which what does that literally mean, Josie?
A piece that is suitable to be honored.
Right. And the we often it'll often be referred to as just Rialit Kabed, but the full phrase is Rialit Kabed Livnei Orchim, right? That like you could honor like a guest with it, right? Which I think in many ways translates to like this could be like a main dish for a guest, right? Like a meatball is not a chaticha realit kabed because that couldn't be like the main course that you served a guest, right? But a hamburger probably is, right? Okay.
I would just say Josie's definition would explain sirloin. He has a different problem with sirloin, but sirloin, it was Ro'ili Kabed. That's how it got its king. What's his name? Put his sword down and said, "This is such a good meal. I deem you sirloin."
Ah,
Just don't mind me. I'm still eating latkes. Okay.
okay. We are going to go into the Tor and Beis Yosef. So we're going to start beginning of our Siman. So if people have the shared Devorah edition, it's on Ayin Reish, aka Reish Ayin, but we don't want to number it Reish Ayin because that would be bad luck. Um, okay. So Kalev, can you read Aleph in the Torah for us? You're
Okay.
on mute.
Uh, חלקה שראויה להתכוון, דינה כבריה שאינה בתה. ואפילו היא אסורה בהנאה, קראינן בראויה להתכוון, כיוון שאם בטל, הייתה מותרת והייתה ראויה להתכוון. אבל טעמה בטל כדין בריה. So a piece that is fit to honor a guest has the same law, excuse me, has the same law as burial, and that it cannot be batal. And even if it is, or specifically if it is something that is forbidden to get benefit from, then we call that a something that
Or
can, uh,
not specifically a filu he.
so even if it can be, even
Yeah,
if it's us or bahana, not just atzma.
right. Even if
Um,
it's why might I have thought that if something, we'll see the opposite of this opinion, but why might I have thought that something that's asur b'hana'a is not a chatichari litkabed? Noam?
Because you can't serve it to guests, at least ones who keep, like, I don't know, halacha.
Right, that like in no capacity you couldn't even serve it to a non-Jew in the current state of affairs. But Kalev, what does the Torah explain? Why is even the Isser Hana'ah fall within this category?
because if it had been batal, it would be mutar, um, and then it would be permitted to give to guests.
Right, the relevant thing is like, are we going to allow you to butt tell this? And if we do, then it's no longer Isser at all, right? So the question is really just about the nature of this thing, but not the question it being an Isser Hana'ah, at least on does not preclude it from being a Chaticha Arelitz Kapet. We might see, well, again, we will see a sort of opinion to the opposite of what the Torah is just expressed, right? And what's the last thing he expresses here?
But the taste of this dish can be batal, just like the dean of Beria.
Right. So this comes from the Mishnah and Gemara that we saw a couple months ago. So, Caleb, do you want to read a little bit more in the Beis Yosef and Aleph? He's going to talk about where we get this in the Gemara.
Okay, חתיכה הראויה להתכבד דינה כבריה שאינה בטלה, בפרק הנעשה, דתנן חתיכה של נבלה או של דג טמא שנתערבו עם חתיכות בזמן שהוא מחירן ונותן טעם, ואם אינו מחירן כולם אסורים. והרוטב בנותן טעם, משכינן.
So that's the Mishnah, which what did the Mishnah say?
That if there is a piece of nevela or a non-kosher fish that is mixed in with other pieces at the time that you can recognize the non-kosher piece and you take it out, and it gives taste, then it can be the taste can be batal. But if you cannot recognize it, then everything is forbidden.
Right. And the sauce, because the sauce is not actually mixed up with the mamashut of the thing, the sauce can be batal b'shishim, but all of the pieces, so long as we can't remove it, are completely usher. But if we remove it, right, again, we say that the tam is batel, right? The flavor can be batel. So if you can actually recognize the thing and remove it, then as long as there's shishim, it's permitted. And so now in the Gemara, right, makshinan,
מקשינן ותבטל אינו מחירן, כולם אסורים.
right,
And if it was, I'm sorry,
right, tivatel beruva. What's the actual challenge?
that it is batal and rove,
Or it
not
should be. It should
necessarily.
be tivatel beruv, right? Which is to say, again, like why do we say if you can't recognize that everything is usher, as long as there's two other pieces, it should be fine, right? Umishani, what's the answer?
משנה חתיכה שראויה להתכבד בה לפני האורחים, כלומר לכל הראויה להתכבד חשובה, אבל לא בטלה, אפילו בעלה. Um, so something that is honorable to be put before guests, and something that is important, and therefore you cannot bottle it, even in 1,000.
Yeah. So this is our main source for like the Chatichar Kabed, but he's about to bring in there is a opinion from the Rif, or really an opinion from the Rif that we mostly infer from absence, that comes from a Mishnah and Gemara and Avodah Zarah. So we'll see what he says about that opinion, and we'll look at the very briefly the bit in Avodah Zarah there. So va'af al pi.
ואף על פי שמדברי הריף נראה דלתא בהאי מתניתין מחנה, מתניתין בפרק בתרא דעבודה זרה, דמשמע מינה, דכל שאין החתיכה מאיסורי הנאה, אף על פי שהיא רואה להתכוון דבטלה, וכמו דדקדק הראש.
V'haran midvarav.
Around.
Right? So what's the Rif's opinion? You're on mute. Kalev, you're on mute.
He says that if it is not something that is forbidden from Anaa, it can be batal, even if it is something that is permitted or like honorable for guests.
Right. This is what I said is like in some ways sort of like lehefech from what the Torah writes, right? The Torah feels the need to say like, oh, even an Isor Hana'ah could be counted as a Chatichar Yalit Kabed, right? That the Torah thinks there's a Hava Amina that a Isor Hana'ah Dafka couldn't be a Chatichar Yalit Kabed. Whereas the Rif, again, largely learned out from the absence of his comments on this section in Chulin, is assumed to believe that things are only not batel if they're also Isurei Hana'ah. Because we have our section in Chulin. There's a Mishnah in Avodah Zarah where it says, Elu asurin va'osrin bekol shehu, right? These things are asur and also forbid with even the smallest amount. And it gives a list of different items, right? And in the Gemara, it asks, what is the Tana, what are the sort of things that the criteria of the Tana for the things that it's listing? And they said tarza itle, right? Davar shebeminyan v'isure hana'ah. That all of the things in the Mishnah are things that can be counted and are asor b'hana'ah, right? And the Rif does comment there. And so people's assumption from his absence of commenting on our specific section is that he actually only thinks Isurei Hana'ah are Eno Batel. But even though the Beis Yosef is generally very loyal to the Rif, Kalev, do you want to finish this off? We have Mikol Makom.
מכל מקום, כל הפוסקים נמנו וגמרו לפוסק ההלכה דחתיכת נבלה שהיא ראויה להתכוון, אינה בטלה, וכדתנן בהרם בפרק הנעשה. וכן כתב הרמב"ם בפרק ו'. So all the poskim rule that the halakha is that a piece of nevela, even though it is honorable for guests, it cannot be batal. Yeah, as we teach here in Perek Nase.
Right. In Gita Nasha, it's explicit that like it's just nevela, right? These aren't Yisurei Hana'a, and nonetheless, the Gemara is very explicit. These are considered Eino Batel. So the Shulchan Aruch, right? The Mechaber says, okay, the Rif, and again, largely learned out from the absence of his commentary here, seems to maybe think things are only Eino Batel if they're Yisurei Hana'a. Everybody else thinks that that is not a relevant criteria, right? Basically, all of the other poskim that we can find say, even if it is not Nisr Hana'a, it still qualifies, and so the Beis Yosef is willing to paskin like every other posik. Okay. Questions on this before we continue? We will see also if we have a time to glance briefly at the Rav Ovadia. I don't know if people had the chance to skim through. He, as is very classic of Rav Ovadia, does revive this opinion of the Rif because he is well known for reviving small minority opinions if they can be combined with other factors as a sad lehakel. Max, I thought you had a hand.
Yeah, just very small. The when he says Nimnu Vigamru here, is that just flowery?
Yeah, he's basically just like that's like there wasn't an official meeting of the post game
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah.
ruled on it. He's just being like, yes, everybody else that you see thinks this.
Yeah, this is a democracy.
Yeah, if we take a roll of the post game, we'll get a significant majority saying it doesn't need Ace or Hana.
But the phrase comes from the Gemara, so
Correct, yes, but he's just using it kind of non-literally here.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So back in the tour, uh Jacob, can you read bet in the tour?
Sure. ודווקא שאיסור המחמת עצמה, כמו נבלה ובשר וחלב. So this idea of chaticha ruya kabed, specifically if it's asur because of itself, like a nevela and basar v'chalav. Aval im nasra machmat shekibla ta'am isur, v'lo hayu b'shishim avatlo, afil misha sover shnech shevet kinevela, ein la din chaticha ruya kabed. Kivan shelo nesra ela machmat tam shekibla. But if something's forbidden because it absorbed the flavor of something else and there wasn't 60 to invalidate that, even for one who thinks that we consider it like Nevela, is that like Hanan Bishari Surim pretty much?
Yeah, they're saying like even those, which again you might
Yeah.
have thought, depending on how we're conceptualizing Hanan, they're literally saying like it's as if it has been Naset Nevela.
Yeah.
Like we don't actually believe that for all purposes, right? Even those who hold
Yeah,
Hanan Bishari Sorim still,
exactly. We don't consider it to be Chaticha Ru'ulit Kabed because it's only forbidden because of the flavor it absorbed.
right? Can you look? We don't need to. The beginning is him just kind of summarizing, but the Beit Yosef bet. Do you see like if are you? Do you have the physical text or are you on
I do
the?
have the physical text.
Okay, so like halfway through the section bet V'nitz ba'er b'divrayhem. It's after the
Yeah.
little. Okay, can you pick up there? He just listed.
Beneath the
He just listed a bunch of post-game who
Okay.
did this.
beneath the בדבריהם שהטעם לפי שאין האיסור שבה ראוי לקבל בו לפני אורחים. אף על גב דמשמע בפרק בתרא דעבודה זרה דחתיכת בשר וחלב אינה בטלה כשראוי לכבד. Okay, so, and it's explained in their words that the reason is because the isser itself that's absorbed, that's not royal kabed before death.
Yeah, but we don't think things can infect stuff indefinitely, right? It's
Yeah.
not that like this piece absorbs like, 1/50th of Isser. And so now it's forbidden. And now it gets to forbid every other piece that it's mixed with. And every single one of those pieces
Hmm.
will forbid every other that like we don't say that like just is continuously infectious, right? The
Yeah.
actual Isser in it is not Riayit Kabed, so it doesn't have that status. And then the Afal Gav is pointing out why might we have not thought this? Because even
Yeah.
though,
Yeah. So yeah, in Avodah Zarah, we learned that but a piece of basar chalav isn't batel when it's re'uyah kabed.
right? But there, Shani Hatam,
Shani hatam dekevan shenitbaslu zaim zeh chozer hakol keguf echad shel iser. Masha in ken bishar isurin. Right. So there, because they're cooked together, it becomes like one body, one object when you find object of Isser, which we don't find with other Isurim.
right?
In Parish of Mordechai, so Parak, yeah, this seems
Yeah, this is
insanely,
mostly kind of summarizing.
yeah.
But yeah, in your own words again, what's the distinction? Why is Basar B'chalav, which are only forbidden because of the cooking together, as it were, different than Isser Balua?
And I guess because the way I would frame it is because it's a Doraita concept, we know it's its own specific category of Isser that makes it one unified object that would become Chaticha Ru'ya Kabed.
Right, that it's Dafka because the combination of the like milk and meat is what creates the Isser.
Mhm.
Right? So because in fact that combination is what
Mhm.
made it Basar V'chalav, that is considered to be kind of Asur Muhammad Atzma. It's not that it absorbed Isser,
Mhm.
it's that it became Isser.
Yeah.
Whereas things that just like absorbed an already existing Isser, that doesn't count.
Mhm.
We also, the main part of why they need to state this is there is a sort of lone opinion. The Ravya thinks that this is not true. The Ravya, um, which are folks familiar with the Ravya? Yes, no, maybe. Yes, no, maybe so. Interesting guy. He is born, he's like 12th century, German within the sort of like Tosafist world, has a couple, is like willing to take some rather unique opinions, even if nobody else supports him. So this is one of them, where he believes that even with an Isser Balua, something can be a Chatichar al Kapet. But similar to the Rif's Date Yachid, this one is really outweighed by basically every other posek. Okay. One thing that I will make note of, but that we're not going to devote a huge amount of time to because it's actually a very long topic, is that on this subject, there's a big debate about cheese, and both the cheese of Goyim and cheese that was like not made by Goyim, but was like made with usher ingredients, and the question of whether those are chatichot or litkabed, um, which it gets very intricate. The main reason we're not going to look into it is because it also relies a little bit on knowing more about the halachot of cheese, which we have not really done yet. And so I think it would be hard for us to fully appreciate in this moment. But maybe we will return to it at some point once we look more into why cheese is usher. But just to put that out there, there is a machloket as to whether the non-Jewish cheeses or cheeses made with isser, the Ramah, for example, and the Taz are on the side of their batel because they're only made from like there's only a little bit of isser in them, right? Most of the material, as it were, is heter. And so similarly to the isser balua, we say like, yeah, that which is actually usser in them is not itself riyalit kabit. Whereas the opinion that says they're not batel says that it kind of, if something is created or curdled via Isser, it's as if the entire thing has that status, right? It's not considered to be like it was absorbed, but rather that is like the nature of this cheese. Okay. Fun digression. We will look at cheese at some point. It is a very fun topic. But for now, we will get on to the very contentious whereas up until now, right, we saw two disputes, as it were, where it's basically all the poskim against one person, right? We had the Rif, who says only things that are Isurei Hana'ah are Eno Batel, and everybody else who says no, it applies to all Isurim. And we have the Rav Ya, who says even absorbed Isur can make something Chatichar Yalit Kabed, and everybody else who says no. Our next subject will have many more party lines. So Josie, do you want to read in the Tor Gimel?
Sure, let me just unmute myself. ובעניין התיכה הראויה להתכבד, כתב אדוני אבי הראש, זיכרונו לברכה, רבו הדעות יש אומרים, שתרנגולות בנוצה וכן חתיכה חיה, כיוון שאינן ראויין עתה, לא חשיבי ראויה להתכבד. So along this category of chaticha re'elet kaved, my father, the Rosh, writes that there are many opinions about this, and there are those that say that chickens that are feathered, is that it? And
Yeah.
And raw meat, because they're not really appropriately right now to be served to a guest, they're not considered ru'ya lehi. Like you wouldn't serve your guest raw meat, carpaccio and stick tartare aside, and you wouldn't serve a chicken with still all feathered up.
Yeah, it's got a while to go
Empire,
before it is
yeah,
inedible.
Empire kosher chicken aside.
So this is one set of opinions, right? And we'll see that there are even kind of distinctions within them potentially. It goes va'afilu. Or Josie, sorry, you're on mute.
Excellent. ואפילו בהמה שלמה בתחילה עד לאחר שנתבשלה וראוי ליתן לפני אורח לכבודו. So even an entire animal is nullified until it's been cooked and it's prepared so that you can serve it up to honor a guest. So you could have the whole duck, as it were. ולא נהירה ולא כאמר ראוי לכבד אלא לשיעורה שתהא גדולה וראויה לכבד באורח לכשנית בשל. We're not talking about something until
What's lo nehira?
That's something I skipped over intentionally because I don't fully understand it.
It means this does not appear like this. It's similar to lo nireli, right? That's not correct. It doesn't appear, right? This is the Rosh. He's still quoting the Rosh, for the record. The Rosh just quoted all these opinions about being like, yeah, if the feathers haven't been plucked, or maybe even if it hasn't been cooked, it's not batel. And then the Rosh is saying, lo nihira. That doesn't make sense. I don't think that's true. And why does he not think that's true?
Because it's not true except in the case where there is a sufficient size of thing here.
Right, the lo ka'amar ruyalit kabed, the reason it uses this term, right, el shiura, that's giving us a metric of size. It's not a metric of something that is ready to be served right now. It's like, is this large enough that it could serve at least one guest, if not many? Right? He says, like, it's about, is it significant? Is it large? Could it feed a number of people? Right? Bashel, right? Once it is cooked. Aval.
But just because it's raw or still be feathered, it's not that doesn't eliminate its chashivut.
Exactly. Vegam.
יש אומרים דכבש שלם או אווז שלם אינו נקרא ראוי להתכבד, שאין דרך ליתן לפני אורח, כבש או אווז שלם. And there are those that say that an entire sheep or an entire goose,
Duck, yeah.
duck, goose, is not is also not called something that's lit kaved because it's not the typical manner to serve somebody an entire sheep or an entire goose.
It's true. But the Rosh does not like this either.
We got we got elu divrei havai, but they're not convincing. Havai hem ki bishvil shurui lechalek lechama hatichot hashuvot garat fe kol sheken nachashiv tfei et shadar kalamanach. So, given that if you cut it up, it would all of a sudden become something like kaved. How would that be? How would somehow being whole be a lesser covetousness?
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's why shouldn't it be something that it's not at least as important as something that you can count?
Right. The Roche kind of has this double whammy where he's both like, first of all, I think you're misunderstanding realit kabed, right? I think that like it's not about can you serve someone this thing right now? It's like, is this a significant enough, large enough thing of Isser that it can be used to feed at least one full guest, if not many? And so like the fact that it hasn't yet been cooked doesn't mean that an entire duck is like insignificant. But he's also like, even if I granted you your opinion about Realit Kabed, what's the nafkamina? Because these things would also be Darkolim notes, right? These are very much countable things, seemingly. And so the Rosh is like, from either perspective, you should not think that these things can be batel. Okay. But we've seen again, we'll parse out some of the nuances because there's a range of opinions about even within the non-Roche school, right? Even within the school that is a little bit more Mekil in their definition, there's still different kind of like madrigot, different degrees of how like not prepared something has to be for it to no longer qualify as Chatichari Alit Kabet. So for the sake of time, I'm gonna read the Beis Yosef on this just because it's long but not especially intricate, just worth going through some of the opinions. So this is Beit Yosef Gimel. Right, so we have the B'inyan Chatichari Kabed, etc. Katav Adoni Avi Rosh. She just quotes through the end. בסוף פרק גיד הנשה, והביא ראיות לדבריו, וכתב שכן משמע מתוך דברי רבנו שמשון, שפירש בשם רי, בריש פרק התערובת. הוא כתב שם בתוספות שלנו. Right, so he's citing where there was his opinions. Right? והרשב"א בתורת הבית כתב סתם כדברי האומרים, דחתיכה שהיא גדולה יותר מדי, לא חשיבה ראויה להתכבד, שמאחר שאין דרכן של בני אדם ליתן כיוצא בה לפני האורחים, אין החשיבה שעומדת היא לכתוך. So the Rashba just brought Stam, right, seemingly as his opinion in the Torah Tabayit, his Sefer on Kashrut, the opinion that something that's just like too big. He doesn't even say like a full goose or something like that, but just like a piece that is much larger than that which you would serve to a person, that even that is not considered Riyayit Kabed, because that is not how you would serve someone. A piece that's this big is not actually going to be any guest's meal. So even though it is going to be cut up and later could be served to people, the Rashba brings this opinion that since it currently is not fit to honor a guest with, it's not a chatichar kabed, right? And the Vehevi Raya, he brought a proof, midaparich perakatar rovot, v'liv telu beruva. So this is about the shore haniskal, right? A shore that is set to be stoned, where it gets mixed up with other animals, and they say, why is it not batel in a rove? Umishani mishum de ba'ale chaim lo batle. The answer was because ba'ale chaim, that's another category of things that aren't basar, like a full living animal is not batelled, right? So it says there it's because a full living animal is not ever nullified. Alma shachut b'tikavate batel. right? Since it specifically said that it's not batel there because it's like baalei chaim, einan batelim. The sort of limud is, it's because it's like a living animal right now that it can't be batel. But if it was shechted, that full ox could be batel. Ad kan lishano. V'chein katav gam kein haran, right? So the Ran wrote similarly. V'smak katav stam she'im habehema im hatsemer o of im notza ein ze karui kabed ubetela v'af al gav d'le'achar miken mesirim hanotza v'haor mikol makom kevan deb'tchilat hata'arovet nitbatlu shuv ein chozrin v'norin. Right, so the smock specifically said when an animal has like its fur or its feathers, then it's not considered riyait kabet, right? And even though we are obviously going to go on to like pluck or defer, I don't know if there's a better word for removing fur, from these animals, and they will then be suitable to be consumed. Since they are not in this state, they will already be battled. And so we don't say that they like close their veneor, right? That like once this becomes in like edible state, it suddenly returns to its isser. If they're not in an edible state, when they're mixed, then the smock thinks you don't have to worry about the fact that they will later change. וכתב בשערי דורה שכן עשה מעשה רבי יעקב בתרנגולת לבלה שנתערבה בשתי שחוטות כשרות והתיר רבנו תם דהואיל ולא נתלה נוצתה אין הרי יתכבד לפני האורחים כמו שהיא. We have a Maisa where Rabbeinu Tam had to rule on this. It's clearly one where there was, some pretty strong pressure because it's actually at a wedding. And it's like for a wedding feast. And there's this like, treifa chicken that gets mixed up with the kosher chickens. And they're like, Rabbeinu Tam, please, is our entire wedding feast like treif? And he's like, no, it got mixed up while it still had its feathers on. And so it can be batel barov. Right? So we saw that Rabbeinu Tam at least ruled that the feathers is sufficient kind of non-preparedness that something is not considered riyayit kabed at that point. So we have kamoshi aval chatichat nevela shelo nimlacha shnitarva b'ksherot אף על פי שאינה ריאלית להתכבד לפני אורחים כמו שהיא, לא בטלה דמליכה לא הווה מחוסר מעשה. But a piece that just hasn't been like salted, at least the smock and the Shari Dora say that still constitutes a chaticha hariyalit kabed, even though it is not fit at this exact moment to be eaten. There's this notion of michusar maaseh that they apply, that this sort of school, the smock and the Shari Dora school, say if something really is like several steps away from being remotely edible, then we can say it's not a chaticha hariyalit kabed. But if it's like, oh, it's just raw, or oh, it just needs to be salted, but it's like a piece of meat, they think it is sort of close enough to food, as it were, in its current state, that that is considered a chaticha hariyalit kabed. Right? Umihu ra'iti kama gdolim shegam benevela shelo nimlacha amriyan shehi betela. Right? But also there are some gedolim, amongst them like the Rambam, the Ra'ah, the Meiri, the whatever, it's actually a pretty long list, who say, even if it's just not been salted, it's not a chaticha hariyalit kabed. Right? Where they say even that step, the fact that it's not edible at this moment, makes it not fall within this category. ורגליים של נבלה שנתערבו בקשירות, אבל לא ניטלו תלתיהן, או אינם ראויים להתכבד ובטלים ברוב. So like they're the legs of animals that haven't had their like hooves removed that get mixed up with ksherot, that they're not considered riyayit kabed according to one opinion, b'telim barov. V'otam ha'osrim b'nevela shelo nimlacha osrim nami im lo nitlu tlapehen ki ruyin nitkabed. The people who say that a non-salted piece is still riyayit kabed also think that a leg which hasn't had the hooves removed is riyayit kabed because those are seemingly considered to be comparably insignificant actions. Right? I will admit to never having prepared an animal carcass, but just from my very limited knowledge, it does seem like removing feathers or hair is a more involved process than chopping off hooves. right? And so they're like, this is closer to being ready to eat, even though it's not fully ready in its current iteration, right? And so v'katvu od, yesh omrim regel shenavela shnitarev im reglaim shel kshera, afilu lo nitzlu tzlata kulam asurim mishum dahabe davar shebeminyan, shederach ha'olam limnot shtayim o shalosh raglaim, right? And there are some who say, even if it's not a chatichar kabed, the legs should be considered davar shebeminyan. And it also shouldn't be batel, right? Because we'll be like, sell me 3 legs. ואנו נוהגים כדי פירשתי לאל, the batel. But we behave like I explained above, that it is batel. וסמך כתב בסימן רשת ד' שהורה ריבה על רגליים של ספק טריפה שנתערבו ברגליים של התר, שאינם בטלים ברוב וקשיא, דהאפילו טריפה הווה להתבטל. וכרבי יוחנן דאמר את שדרכו למנות שנינו, ושם משום חשש כבוד נגעו בה, דמסתמה רגל בהמה גסה, עשוי להתכבד. ושל דקה נמי, אפילו אם תמצא לומר דאינו עשוי להתכבד, מכל מקום לא פלוג רבנן, ואם לא הסירו צלפיהם, צריך עיון. Okay, so the smock mentions this case where we do have, again, legs of an animal that get mixed up. And they say everything is usser. And there's this sort of question because we hold like Rabbi Yochanan et shedar kolim not, right? The things that are only ever sold by number are the ones that are not batel. And seemingly, maybe legs are sometimes sold by weight, I guess, from what he's saying. Again, having not bought a leg, I can't really speak to that, but that is what's being implied here. He says maybe there it's because, well, the legs of a large animal would always be realit kabed. Because of that, maybe we just treat legs of any animal, even if maybe legs of like a goat are actually not considered so significant. Maybe because of like lo plug rabbanan, we're just going to treat legs of animals, at least according to some opinions, as inherently significant chunks of meat. But then we have the Bedek Habayit, right? This is the Beis Yosef going back and like adding in a comment to his own commentary, where he says, לעניין הלכה, כיוון דהד התיכריה יתכבד לא בטלה אינו אלא מדרבנן, הלכה כדברי המקילים, right? Since this is only a dirabanan rule to begin with, that a chatichahri yitkaber is not batel. It's like, we go like the Mekel opinion, which, as we'll see, is like he goes by the most Mekel opinions, i.e., if it's not cooked, it's not a chatichahri yitkaber, right? It can have every other step done. If it hasn't been cooked, we'll see that the Machaber thinks it doesn't count as real yitkaber. Okay. Questions on that before we take a little look at the Ramah and the Bach? Noam?
Yeah, just at the beginning, I'm trying to understand the Rashba pointed to this Gemara Bashar Niskal, and I'm just not understanding how it supports his position. If you want to help me with that.
Yeah, I would say obviously there are those who don't believe his inference is a sufficient one, but because in the case of the living shore, the reason that it gives for why, which we don't actually generally see in most other places, for why it's not batel is specifically that Bale Chaim aren't batel. He reads that as like a specification, right? It's saying, yeah, it's because Bale Chaim aren't batel. It's because it's currently a live shore mixed with other live shvarim. But that if it was like a shechted shore mixed with shechted shvarim, then it might be batel. Because if the reason it's not right now is
Oh,
specifically that
yeah.
it's a Bal Chaim, then it might be that the other sort of categories of things that aren't batel don't apply to it.
Right. Okay.
Obviously, those in like the Roche camp would explain it as being like, it wasn't listing the only reason it's not batel, it was listing one of them, right? That was like the most applicable at the moment, that it's a Baal Chaim, but that's not necessarily to the exclusion of other categories, right? So it's
Hmm.
certainly not the only way you can read that, but that is how that inference appears to be working. Okay.
Thank you.
Um, let's look we'll see this a little bit in, yeah, we're gonna look the Rama talks about a lot of different body parts. We'll see in the Shulchan Aruch mention of different like innards and like intestines and things, and the questions of whether these innards are considered to be significant and realit kabed. But no, actually, do you want to read in the Darchei Moshe? Do you see on page Resh Ayin Aleph? Do you have the physical copy?
No, I'm on Alatora, but I could read it if
You
I
can
find
search
it.
words. It says
Yeah, so I will.
Od Katav Rosh Behema Gasa. For
Here, I'll
those
just
who
look
do
up
have the
Gus.
physical copy, it's on the left column of the Darchei Moshe on Resh Ayin Aleph. It's like four
Which oat?
in the Aleph with the asterisk.
I'm not sure it is on Al HaTorah because I
Like I
think
have
I
Katav Be'Haruch Deraglaim Shel Be'ema Gasa Mikre Ra'li Kabet.
Um, that is we have a Baruch Klal. Yeah, no, the Od Katav Baruch is next. This is
So
Od
then I
Katav.
don't think we have it because that's the only time that Gasa appears on this page.
I will return to you then.
Sorry.
It is okay. Isaac, do you have a physical copy?
I do. You said Ode Katav Rosh?
Od Katav Rosh Behema. So it's like the
Okay,
bottom
great.
left.
Yeah, yeah, the head of the
Mhm.
Od Katav Rosh Behema Gasa Odaka Overglaim Shel Behema Gasa Mikri Shapir Roi Lehitkabed Vafilu Regel Shel Behema Daka Einan Betelim אף על גב דאינן ראויים להתכבד, מטעם דבר שבמניין אינן בטלים. Okay, so the head of a large or a small cattle, or not cattle, but like a goat or a sheep or a cow, um, or the feet of a big animal are considered royal hit kabed, and even the foot of a small animal is not batel because even though it's not royal hit kabed, it's still davar b'minyan because, like we discussed before, you'll say like I want to buy two cows' feet or whatever. Sorry,
Exactly.
no, these are small ones, so it'd be like two goat feet.
Exactly.
Okay. ובבית יוסף כתב בשם הסמק להפך, דרגליים של בהמה דקה יש לאוסרן משום חתיכה הראויה להתכבד, אבל אין לאוסרן משום דבר שבמניין, דעת שדרכו למנות שנינו עד כאן לשונו. ו... מדין תבררי.
The Rama is saying like we'll
אבל
get more.
Yeah, midin devarim sheba minyan. Okay, so in other words, so the Beit Yosef writes that the Smach has the opposite opinion, which is that feet of small animals they should be considered haticha hariri alahit kabed and therefore aser, and not batel. But you shouldn't consider them aser because because of devar sheba minyan status. Um, because let's see if I can reconstruct this properly. Um, so what he's saying, so literally this is because we teach at Shedar Kolim note. So he's saying again, this is the sometimes it's he's what he's saying is that
Sometimes
this
told by weight.
Beiro Yosef is telling us that Smach says that sometimes these feet are sold by weight, not simply by number. Ergo, they are not at Shedar Kolim note, so they're not a problem on that.
Basically, we've seen, well, they are a problem, but just for a different reason.
Sorry. Yeah, so I'm trying to
It's
say
like,
like it's the
yeah,
opposite reason.
the Ramah's like everyone actually seems to be agreeing, or at least other than obviously this is excluding those who think that a piece needs to be like cooked before it can be batel. But everyone who is kind of like further up on the scale agrees that these aren't batel. The question is just, is it because they're devar minyan or is it because they're
Yeah.
chat kabet? Okay.
Is there anyone who holds that they're both?
There are some, yeah, which
Okay.
ends up being like, okay, great, it's really not batel. Kind of mima nafshach. Also, I see your question of how does it make sense? So there aren't any people who would say that a big animal leg is a meal, but a whole goose is not, right? It's
Okay.
there are the people who say things are only realit kabed if it's like chopped and cooked and ready, and those people would say neither of those things is realit kabed.
Mhm.
Or there's people in the Roche camp who say, no, it's about size. It's about could this feed, a full guest or multiple people? And he would say both of those things are realit kabed.
Okay.
But speaking of the duck,
Thanks.
keep reading a bit. Od katav
Oh,
ba'aruch.
okay. Od katav ba'aroch. דאור שומן של הוויז, אם נטרפה אחת ונתערבה באחרות, הווה חתיכה הראויה להתכבד ואינה בטלה. ומיכו אם יכולים להכיר שהוא מן הטרפה, כל האחרות מותרים. עד כאן לשונו. על איזה דבר יש לסמוך שאחת מהן היא הטרפה. Okay. So then he wrote in the Aroch that the fatty skin of a duck that was trefa, um, if it was mixed in with others that are presumably mutar, it's considered hatecha haruyalahit kabed, so it's not batal. However, whoa, surprise, if you're able to recognize the one that's aser, all the others are still mutar.
Right. This gets into what we'll see at the end. It doesn't come up in the Torah, but we'll see this in the Beis Yosef and in the Shulchan Aruch. These kind of wacky scenarios where you have different like pieces of animals and whether you can
Mhm.
identify the ones that are the problem. And if so, then
Right.
maybe that's enough to like machshir everything else. Okay. But yes, the avuz, because seemingly it's like very fatty, the skin is like more chashuv than that of like some of the other animals.
It's like Peking duck.
Yes, I think from what I know that to be. Um, okay, one more. The Ramah brings another relevant question of things that do or don't count. Katav b'hagahot shari Dora.
Okay, כתב בהגהות שערי דורה, דכל דבר שאינו נעשה רק כדי קליפה, הואיל והחתיכה עצמן אינה אסורה, אף על גב שהיא חתיכה הראויה להתכבד. בטל, דדבר האסור בה, דהיינו הקליפה אינה ראויה להתכבד, עד כאן לשונו, והוא סברת התוספות. Okay, so in Shari Dura, anything that is only forbidden as much as a klipa, which is like a thin layer on top of, on the outside of the meat. Hang on, I lost my place as I looked up. Okay. You would think that then the piece itself is not aser, even though the piece is considered the whole piece is considered hadichai kabed. It's batel because the actual aser piece is only the klipa, and nobody serves someone a klipa as like, here's your meal. I scraped off this much, right? Like when you go to a deli and they only scraped off this much meat for you, you're angry and you like leave a bad Yelp review. Um,
Yeah, a little slice of the meat. They're like, again, this is similar to the idea of the balua, which is that like the
mhm.
actual thing that is usr is itself not realit kabed, even if it is part of a larger piece that would be realit kabed. So
Right. And I mean, I think in this case, you're even more in the clear, right? Because in the case of the Balua, it's actually throughout,
right, it's in
presumably, the entire Haticha, whereas in this case, it's literally just kind of like a wrapper. I mean, it's
right
not
here
literally a wrapper, it's like the outer
actually
layer.
localized and something you could
Yeah.
slice off and it would be not sufficient. This is another case where I think somewhat consistently the Ravya disagrees, and he thinks that a klipa also could be right realit kabed. Okay, we're gonna look. The Bach is going to quote the Maharshal, who takes aim at some of these questions that are raised by the Rosh around like the opinion of those who think that like the animals that haven't been fully prepared are not realit kabed, right? The challenges that the Rosh brings. So we are in the Bach, where this is in the middle of the Bach Dalid. It begins with Vihiksha Maharshal. If you're in the book, it's Ayin Resh Bet in like the middle of the Bach there, near the bottom of the Torah lines, Vikshem Harshal. Or if you're on Alatar, you can hopefully search those words and find it. Max, can you read for us?
Sure. V'yikshem Harshal, Tarnagolas b'nitzota, amai batla, halo havidavar sheb'minyan. Um, okay, so the Marshal asks, why would we say that that the chicken that is still feathered um is batel. Even if you say that it's not ru'ui liskabed, it would still be a davar shebeminion, which is a problem. Kirikaimalan kol shadar kol imanos lifamim eino batel. So he's taking um, the coal
Right, the more
side,
expansive.
right? Kirikasa b'siman kuf yud. Okay, that's the challenge. V'tiretz kevan demenetosa meusahi niskalkel chashivusa legamre uvatel. Okay, so because there's another factor at play, which is that it's disgusting with the feathers, and so the other piece that's important here is it chashuv, and here it's not because it's disgusting, or it's not anymore.
Yeah.
The two kevan de mochrim tarnagolas al harov biyichidus lo have davar shebeminyan, right? And also because you usually don't uh you don't buy one chicken. Is this what you're saying?
I think he's actually saying because you do buy one chicken, like, which is a really fascinating argument to make. I think
Uh-huh.
he's saying like you don't usually buy them by number because you're just getting a chicken, which one could easily argue makes it more significant if it's a thing that you would just buy one
Yeah.
of. But I think he's kind of making this clever argument of since people are actually often just buying a chicken, it's not really a thing that you're buying in numbers.
Uh-huh. Okay. V'teda sharei shor haniskal masik talmuda de lo batil mishum chashivus. Mishum chashivus bal chai. And the Gemara concludes that shor haniskal isn't batel because what's important about the shor haniskal is the entire shore. Um, that did something important when it was alive. V'tipukle mishum davar shebeminyan, or v'tipukle mishum davar shebeminyan. Wait, meaning that. Hold on.
Where it's saying like this is the challenge we explained, or the svara we explained from the Rashba, the same thing of being like, oh, it's saying it's not batel because it's a balei chaim. Derive it from the fact that it's a davar shebeminyan. That should be a reason that
Right, that
it's
could be
not
enough.
batel, right? Rather,
Okay, ela vadai mashe mochrin biyichidus lo have davar shebeminyan. Right, but from the fact that it's sold, that you only buy one, that means it's not a minion. So that he's just deriving from that Shor Niskal case over to our part.
yeah, it's the same, like as in the same source the Rashba was using as a derivation, but the Maharshal kind of adds something, right? The Rashba just kind of derived from the fact that it says it's, Balei Chaim, Batel, that it's saying that to the exclusion of other things, but the Maharshal is actually trying to explain why would it not be these other categories, right? And so he's saying, oh, it's not a Devar Minion because, again, this very clever, albeit somewhat unintuitive chiluk, that something that's sold by itself, right? Not in numbers, but just by itself, is actually not a davar shebiminion. Okay. Mishum hachi.
Umishim hachi kasa b'tshuvas uh, mahari berin the tarnagolas ena kriya davar shebeminyan kmo behema ad kan lashono. Right, and also there's this truth of the mahari that chickens just don't have the same davar shebeminyan status as behemoths do. V'yen b'mordechai perakama debeitza b'masa de Rabbeinu Tam de Tarnagolas ben Nitzosa shekasav v'afal gav de Tarnagolas davar shebeminyan uberia v'have davar chashuv v'davar chashuv afilu be'elef lo batel v'chulei mochach midvarav de kivan dehi ben Nitzosa batel kol chashivusa shehayala shehayala. All right, and there's also this the Rabbeinu Tam case that that Rabbeinu Tam seems to paskin that if the feathers are still there, it's similar to what we saw at the beginning with the marshal that it's lost its chashivish, and that's that.
Right. The next bit is just sort of repeating the Shor. We see lots of people are picking up on the Shor Niskal. It is a popular a popular source for those who want to say that these like big animals can actually in some cases be batel. Um, so this is interesting. Before, I mean, we're after this, we'll move on to our next topic, which is when these things get chopped up. But how, based off of the different opinions we've seen on like both what is considered chatichari kabed and what's considered devar minyan, how are these players understanding those categories? Why do they think those categories are not batel? And how does that impact what they think falls into said category? Is the question clear or should I restate that?
Could you restate it, please?
Yeah, that we see again that there is this pretty vast range of opinions as to whether things that are not, a cooked steak in front of you, whether a bunch of other stuff could be a chatichariat kabed, or if they are not a chatichariat kabed, if they're maybe still a devar shebiminion. And again, there's a pretty big range. You have the Rosh, who's like, all of these big shechted animals, they're both, right? It's chatichari kabed because they're so big, and it's devar minyan because it's also a thing that you would count. And you have people, the Hefech, saying like, nah, as long as these things aren't cooked, they're batel, right? And so, and we also have this idea coming up in the Maharshal of like maybe because something is ma'us, um, it kind of exits these categories. So my question is, how are some of these players like the Rosh or the Smak or the Maharshal? If you don't remember who said what, you can just relate to the opinion. But how are they understanding these categories of like what constitutes Chatichar Kabed and why therefore it's not batel? Jacob?
One thing that I think is a significant factor is Ticha Re'uya Kabed is kind of a shorthand for it's about Lifnei Orchim. So I guess part of it is it a form that a guest can just eat?
Yeah, I mean that's the big thing. Like the opinions, the one that, and we'll see the Machaber ultimately Paskins like that say it's only if it's like mivush, if it's been cooked, are like they see this as being about you have food in front of you that is ready to be consumed, and if you batal these, you can serve an extra guest, right? And so like that's what's relevant, and that things that happen kind of earlier in that process it's they basically don't think that that's what Chati Chayreit Kabed is referring to. That it's kind of like, okay, I have food in front of me. Could I feed an extra person right now if this is batel? Right? But not like, oh, I've got some animals mixed up and there might be a problem here, but you know what? I'll pluck all the feathers and I'll chef them and there was maybe a treifa chicken amongst these, but by the time it becomes a cooked chicken, that's a distant memory. Um, versus what's the sort of the Roche's approach to Chati Chayreit Kabed? Reuven?
This also relates to how I was going to answer your question, which is I think it has to do with um, each posek's opinion about what is the nature of the chashivuta behind each. And for the Rosh, it seems to be like serving size, or it's like the chashivut of how can this serve at least one person? Is it substantial? Versus maybe the approach of mius being maybe more of like, is it kvodik to actually serve it to someone? Are you going to honor them? Will they feel honored? Is totally different, I think, idea of the chashivuta, the nature of the chashivuta.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that the Roche is really getting to this question of like it's about size, right? It's about like if something is like big, that's something that would provide food for a number of people. The question is like, are you getting meals for people by this being butt-held? And he's like, it doesn't matter if that's further down the process. Eventually you will pluck this chicken or you will, singe the hair from this cow and you'll serve it and you'll feed a bunch of people. And so that is like chashuv because it's a whole cow, right? Whereas, yeah, the sort of perspective of the muse also is this question of like right now, do I relate to this as like something like kavodik and significant, right? Like even as someone who again, doesn't eat meat, so perspective is limited. I think the way I relate to like a cooked steak versus like a slaughtered chicken with feathers, even though the latter is like bigger and could feed more people, like in a lot of ways, I think most people refer to like a nice cooked steak would relate to that as much like nicer or fancier or more important because it is like a fancy piece of food that you could consume as opposed to, yeah, a thing that a lot of people intuitively will relate to as gross, that is several steps away from being consumable food. Um, and similarly, yeah, we see the whole Devar Minion thing where, the Maharshala's thing about things that are sold by themselves not counting. I will say for me, that feels like a bit of a formalist chiluk. Like it feels to me like something that's sold by itself is dafka pretty important if you would buy it by itself. I think it's very clever. I'd be interested if anyone has a non-formalist defense of the Maharshal in that respect. But yeah, I think a lot of this is really getting into like what stage of the food process do we care most about, right? And again, there are some people who, for a few of these categories, think it's not chatichar yalit kabed, but it is davar shebiminion. In which case, in some ways, there's not so much of a nafkamina, right? Because, like, in that it's still not batel, it's just from a different category. But if you think it's neither, it's because you think that these things that are really, even if very large, are like several steps away from being something you could feed someone, are in their current state not that important or not as important. I think I saw a hand.
It was me. I was just going to attempt the non-formalist uh, explanation of a Marshall. Like, it would make sense to me that if someone's buying multiple chickens and there's just kind of a standard price for every single chicken, that might like add to the chashivut of the like unit of the chicken in general. Whereas if you just buy one, you're like, okay, this one costs that much, and you just buy one on its own, then I don't know if this makes sense, but you might just kind of be setting a price for one object, but there's no like special hashivut to the unit of the chicken, like in the other example. I don't know.
I think it's a smart explanation. Um, so yeah, we'll see. Again, it is, I think, because more broadly, when we're talking about all of these categories of things that are not batel, like there seem to be some overlap, but they're not synonymous, right? As Ruben pointed out, Devar sheyesh lo matirin, right? It seems to be it's not the main logic doesn't seem to be that it's so significant, right? We'll dive into that more when we go into that siman, but there's something about it that makes us not want to batel it, but it's maybe not about chashivus, right? Whereas like Riayat Kabed and Devar Minyan do seem to be about like this thing is significant in a way to the point that we really can't conceptualize it like being nullified in a mass, right? That it remains significant even when mixed in with a lot, right? Birya also potentially about chashivas, potentially about like, yeah, like the notion of like a full thing, right? Also feels different than like little pieces or flavor, like a full entity. I think instinctively feels different to people. And maybe that's chashivas, maybe that's some other kind of metric we could define. But it is interesting. What we'll see again when trying to compare the rules between these. The question of what we understand as the underlying logic will impact in what categories we think we can learn from one to the other or not. Okay. I think we'll pause here. We'll come back in 5 minutes and we'll pick up with Vav in the Torah. With Vav in the Torah. So now we're going to get to something we saw this referenced a bit with Joel. We're talking about Birya, but we'll come up here as well, the question of whether something can lose its chashivas. So Noam, can you start by reading Vav in the Torah?
Okay, it starts v'had debiria. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. V'had debiria v'chaticha re'uya lo batle davka be'odam shleimim. Sorry, 1 second. Let me just move this window. Aval im nitrasku batle the tu lo chashive. So when it comes to a birya and a chaticha royale kabed, there's no beetle for them specifically so long as they're shalem. But if they splinter or fragment, then there is beetle because the individual fragments no longer have chashivut.
Mhm.
ואפילו אם נאסר כבר התערובת ונשרקו אחר כך, מתבטלים. And that's even in a case where they enter into the Taravet full, they splinter while within the Taravet, and in that case, there is Bitul.
Right. It's an
Um,
interesting thing where you could easily envision, like, we saw the reverse of this, of, people saying, well, once it's buttheld while it's insignificant, if it then later becomes significant once you prep it, it doesn't lose its nullification status. It stays nullified. But here, lahafech, when we say it initially wasn't nullified because it was chashuv, if it does lose its chashivas, we say the B tool can still happen. It hasn't been permanently rendered usr. Okay.
ודווקא שנתרסקו הביריה והחתיכה בשוגג, אבל במזיד, שכיוון לבטלם אסור למי שכיוון לבטלו. So this is specifically in a case where it's been fragmented or splintered accidentally or inadvertently, but if one were to do it deliberately, then there would not be B-tool, at least for like the intended target of the intended beetle. I don't know if that made
Yeah,
sense.
but again, because that is you are now making B-tool possible, it's the same as the ruling in general with Mivatal Isser L'Chatchila, right? That if you do
Mm.
that intentionally, and if you do it for yourself or anyone else, you get a knas, you're like punished by not being allowed to eat it, but fundamentally it is kosher, and so other people can eat it. Okay, and then in the Beit Yosef, can you read, you can, hopefully this is on all the Torah, the V'zel Lashon HaRashba b'Torah Tabayit, and it's V'zel
Do
Lashon
you
is,
want to read a few more words? Because I just think those are all going to be Roshei Tavot.
yes, b'Torah Tabayit, Nechtach mimena o shenitraska ad shene'avda tzurata.
Yeah, I found it. Great.
Okay.
וזה לשונו הרשב"א בתורת הבית, נחתך ממנה או שנתרסקה עד שנאבדה צורתה, אין זה בריה ובטל חשיבותה. So, according to the Rashba, if something's cut off from it or it's splintered until the point where it actually loses its shape, then it's no longer a birya and its significance has been nullified. He keshar kol isurin, just like all other isurin. V'afilu nechtach mimena achar nit'arva. And this is, like we said, even in a case where it's only been cut up after it's entered the Torah. Uvaruch katav b'shem haramban denechtach mimeno ever bainan. Oh, and
Ba'aya velo ifshita.
Baya velo yifshita. So they asked a question about where a limb came off, but it was never answered in the Gemara. Is that right?
Yeah, like that with regard to Gabe Malkot.
Oh, gabe malkot. Vehu adin le isur. V'mihu birya de lo batla de Rabbanan he ve'lekula. But we are makil in that case. Sorry, I don't really know the context of the
Right.
sugin in Nazir. So
There it's talking about, again, obviously like Doraita questions where if you're consuming this actual thing, right, are you chayav malkot? Right? But the ruling that a birya is never batel is not a question of are you chayav malkot, right? It is at most dirabanan. And so they're pointing out that while it wasn't completely answered like definitively, the question of whether for the purposes of like malkot for a Torah level thing, whether one limb being cut off would be sufficient. He says, like, for Biria, which the whole ruling that it's not Batel is only Dirabanan, we can be Makil, right? The
and so
Insari,
it's no longer birya, right?
yeah.
When the lemons come off. Okay. Ein zarich lomar merusak v'nechtach mimeno ever shenishmetu tluya bo devadai betela. And you don't need to say that you have to like totally cut off and like I don't know, crush the limb that's like hanging off from it because
It doesn't need to be a limb that its life depends on.
oh shenishmato yeah sorry ever shenishmato teluya bo oh right devadai betela yeah it could even just be another kind of a limb.
Right. They're like in that scenario, certainly, because it's like the kind of thing that it's considered to like be changing it fundamentally if it's like a thing that without which it could not live. But even if you hacked off like a leg, that still counts. So the next
Mhm.
is kind of reiterating some of these questions about the birya and also the how we relate to the Evarim. So I want to skip a couple lines. Do you see we have Katuv Bahaga Bishem Maharai, a couple lines below this.
Vikatvu be'agav b'shem harai, yeah.
Mhm.
Um, uh,
Zelush.
זה זה לשונו. יראה דאם הוא שלם לגמרי, רק שנפעל ממנו קצת על ידי בישול, כמו שרגילות הוא להתפרפר, ודאי חשיב בריה.
Okay.
Okay, so if it's full, but just a little bit of falling off, then it's still a birria. That's not
Wait,
considered
a
like
little
real
bit falls
reason
off how?
through cooking.
Right. That he's saying like a lot of things break up a little bit while cooking. Like lots of things, like little bits will fall off from them or parts of it will start to dissolve while you're cooking. And if it was like even that counts, he's like, well, that would end up actually like affecting most things that start to kind of break up a bit while you're cooking them. So he's like, if it was totally intact when it went into the mixture and like some parts of it are like crumbling off because you're cooking it, that doesn't count, right? It's not batel. It has to be that it's been like shmushed or significant part has been like chopped off or removed in some other way that's not just it cooking off of the food. Okay. That is our um bit about the mitrasku. And finally, we'll get the question of what happens when some of the things in the pot have been chopped up, but not all. Reuven, do you want to read Zayin in the Torah?
Yes, let me see. Okay. Okay. ומיהו אף על פי שנחתכה חתיכה אחת, אין תולין לומר האיסור נחתך ומתבטל, ויהיה כולן מותרות, אלא אותה שנחתכה לבד מותרת ממה נפשך. אם היא של האיסור אף כולן מותרות, ואם אינה של איסור הרי היא לבדה מותרת, והשאר אסורות, ואפילו נחתכו רובן אין תולין שהאיסור מן הרוב שנחתכו, אלא כל הנחתכות מותרות והשלמות אסורות. Okay, so let me do my best because I didn't fully grasp this. Okay, so on the other hand, even if a single piece, a single chaticha becomes cut, or like cut in half, or it's cut in some sense. I don't understand the language of ein tolin. Is that to say that
We kind of don't
yeah,
ascribe to it, right?
is
Like
that
we don't,
is
yeah, we don't ascribe, like we don't basically don't rely upon, literally like hang upon it, the idea
right?
that that piece was the Isser piece.
Meaning, if a chaticha is cut in half, which piece then are we referring to? The piece.
We're referring to that original piece, which is
Okay,
mixed
the
with
original
other
piece.
pieces. If one of the pieces mixed together gets chopped up, such that it would no longer be considered chashuv, we're saying we don't say, well, that must have been the Isser piece, and now everything is permitted.
I understand. Okay. Right. Vihi, we don't say vihi kulan mutarot.
Right? Rather,
Like that must be an Isser piece, and therefore everything else is permitted. Rather, it's just that one piece that was rendered in half that is considered permitted. Why? From a manavshach argument, because on the one hand, If that piece had actually been the Isser piece, then everything else in the pot would be permitted. And if that was not actually the Isser piece, then that piece itself would be permitted and all the others would be forbidden.
Exactly. Right? Like
And
either it's the Isser and now everything's batel, or it's not the Isser and then it's not the Isser. Great. So like the pieces that have been chopped up, and the last bit is just saying, right, not only when there's one piece, right, but even, right, that feeling
right,
fun.
definitely Ruban, right? Even if most is this meaning the majority of the pieces in the Kidera have been cut up. We still don't say that the majority. Wait, what's his name? Ein tolin isor min harav shnei. We don't say that the thing that's actually forbidden belongs to the majority of the pieces that have been cut in half, or the majority of the pieces in the Kedera which have been cut. Right, but all of the pieces that have been cut are permitted. V'hashlemut asurot. And then the rest are forbidden.
The intact ones, right, the complete ones are forbidden,
Yeah,
right? So basically, until the last piece is chopped up, you can't assume that the intact ones, you can't treat any of the intact ones as
right.
being permitted, because until the very last one, we say maybe that is the Isser, right? So anything that's been chopped up, again, because of this mimah nafshach, can be eaten. Anything that is still fully intact cannot be eaten. Okay, we'll look a little bit at a Taz that explains some of the logic of like how we're ascribing the identity there. But let's flip to the Shulchan Aruch. Some of this we won't have to see in depth because it is nearly identical to what we just saw in the Torah. But we'll look at some of the additions or changes. Okay. So, which is also, it's on Lamed Zayin in the book pages, if that's helpful to anyone. So the first Sif is pretty much verbatim what we saw in the Torah, right? That the Chatichar Yalit Kabed is not batel, and this applies even if it's an Isser Hana. Again, not only, but even if it's an Isser Hana. And the Ramah just adds that even if it's only Asr Durabanan, it's still not batel, right? That you might have thought, oh, well, the rule that Chatichar Yalit Kabed isn't batel is itself Durabanan. So maybe if you stack on that the fact of the Isser itself being only Durabanan, we don't have to be Machmir, and he says no. Like this applies to any Isser. But because the rule, we saw this with Biria last week, 2 weeks ago. When we did Biria, we saw this rule that since the principle of it not being batel is Durabanan, if there's a suffix as to whether this constitutes a Chaticha Haryalit Kabed, it is batel. If the suffix is whether it's usr, but you're like, if it is usr, it's definitely a chatichar yalit kabed, then we don't incline towards the Mekel ruling. We say, misafek, we treat it as forbidden. But if you're like, I don't really know whether this piece would constitute, is like quite significant enough to fit that definition, then we can go lakula and we can have it batel barov. Okay. Um, and in bet, we also see um the same idea that it has to be asor mechamat atzma, right? That if it just absorbs something, then we don't treat it as chatichai realit kabed, again, because the thing that is absorbed in it is not realit kabed. So, we have, and the Rama also adds that like, a chaticha that hasn't been salted, um, also counts as something that's not realit kabed because it's only the blood that's in it that is forbidden. It's not the actual piece is not forbidden, right? Unlike most other isurim, where we don't say the isur can just like leave it, right? It can be nullified, but we don't say the isur can just be like leached out. Whereas with like a piece that hasn't been salted, it's actually just the blood in it is forbidden, but you can remove that blood, right? Therefore, he says a non-salted kosher piece of meat does not count as a chatichar lit kabed because the blood is not chashuv. Okay. So now we'll see how the Machaber rules on the question of our different animal and carcass types. So Ori, are you readable or not so much? Gonna take that as not so much. Jacob, can you read Gimel in the Shulchan Aruch?
Sure. Tarnagolet b'notzta shnit arba b'achirot batla hari eina ru'uya litgabe l'fnei ha'orchim k'mot. So chicken with feathers that's mixed with others is batel. It's not ru'uya litgabe before guests in the form that it currently is.
Mm-hmm.
ואף על פי שאחר שנתערבה הסעירו הנוצה וכן לא חשיבה ראויה להתאבד, אלא אם כן היא מבושלת. So even after it's mixed, even though after it's mixed, the feathers are removed.
Right. We saw this idea that even though they will eventually be removed, if they're there when it's mixed, it's batel, right? And so then he adds another category, right? It's not even realit kabed if what?
Um,
Ela im ken hi mevushelet.
Unless it's cooked.
Yeah. Right? The Machaber goes like the sort of the most makil set of opinions. We saw him mention this in the Bedek Habayit, but he goes like the most lenient, which is the sort of Ramban, Ramah, Ra'ah, Meiri, Ritva camp, which is has to be an edible cooked piece. Right? And he continues, V'chein keves shalem.
וכן כבש שלם או חתיכה גדולה יותר מדי, לא חשיבה ראויה לכבד, שאין דרך ליתן לפני האורח כבש שלם או חתיכה גדולה יותר מדי. ויש חולקים בכל זה. And so too, a whole sheep or a larger than usual piece, they're not considered ra'uya lekabed since it's not normal to put these before a guest. But there are those who argue with all of this.
Right. The Machaber is like, I'm gonna initially state kind of stam the most lenient opinion, but there are people who don't agree with any of this, right? Or who don't agree with some of this. And now we're going to get one of those examples. What does the Ramah say?
וכן נוהגים. מלבד תרנגולת מנוצתה דמחוסרת מייסה גדול דנוהגים בה שהיא בטלה. Thus is our minhag. Is that saying that like the arguments, the cholkim are?
It's confusing syntactically, but when he says because he's doing the chen no hagin off of the yesh cholkim, like there are people who say all these things are realit kabed, and the Ramah is like that's us, we're those people. Except for the case of the bird with its feathers, and also
V'chein raglayim ovros shelo nefrachu nisa oran. אבל אם כבר נפרחו חשיבי חתיכה ראויה להתכבד. And also legs or a head that we haven't removed, that the hair hasn't been removed from them. But if they have already been removed, it's considered חתיכה ראויה להתכבד. אפילו לא נמלכו עדיין, even if it's not yet salted. ואפילו כבש שלם אינו בטל, and even a full sheep isn't batel. Mihu raglayim shel ofot milvad raglay uvas v'chein raglay behema daka b'midinot elu lo chasivei klal uvatelim. Yeah. So however, the legs of birds, except for the legs of a goose.
Right, because those are nice and fatty, so presumably those are like edible, but like chicken legs, seemingly are not super valuable. So
And
those
so
legs,
too,
and also
legs of a skin of a thin animal in our countries um, that are not considered anything, and they're batel.
Mm-hmm.
Rosh shel ofot eno chasuv levatel. And the head of birds isn't considered important, and it's batel.
Right. As we'll see in the next couple of Seifim, once we get into this question of like chashivus, they really end up like we had the kind of bigger questions of like, is an animal that has not yet been like fully cut and cooked, etc.,
Mhm.
can that be counted? But beyond that, then we're like, what about the different parts, right? What parts of
Mhm.
the animal are considered important, right? So they're like, a chicken head is not the main thing people are eating from the chicken, and it doesn't have a lot of meat. So, like, that's not considered so chashuv. Whereas, like, a goat head or a cow head would have presumably more meat. And the idea is that that is considered significant if the hair has been removed,
Mhm.
right? That the Ramah he paskins like the smock, which is still a step more makil than the rosh. If you recall, the rosh is like, if it's an animal, it's a chatcharet kabed, right? It's a big thing that'll serve lots of people. It doesn't matter that it's not there yet. Whereas Ramah picks up on this michusar maaseh framework of saying like, if it's close to something that could be cooked, right? There are not many steps between where it is now and it being an edible piece of meat, then it counts. Okay. Now we'll get into some interesting specific examples of different animal parts. Josie, do you want to read Dalid in the Shulchan Aruch?
Sure. Shuman hachnata eno rile kaved, aval or shuman avaz mikre rile kaved eno batel. So rendered fat, is that what this is, or
Fat
chunks of
from
fat?
like the intestine or like the colon. The kansa is one of those.
So this sort of internal fat is not considered something that's lihit kabed, but this says or shuman, fatty skin, shuman avaz, like the fatty skin of a duck,
Mm-hmm.
is considered really kaved, ve'enu and is not batel. So it's just straight up this internal fats, like this big blob of internal fat, is not is not chashuv, and but the crispy skin of your Peking duck is.
Right. And then we get another non-chashuv thing. Look at the korkavan in
Korkavan, which is
like the
the cane
craw
sharp. I am. This is
bird
you can
stomach.
turn it some kind of internal organ, or the on the maw. You said.
The craw.
The cane sharp I am and unreim lekavitz. All these sort of internal organs are not considered chashuv. So
Yeah. A little intestine is not considered to be chashuv enough, apparently. At least according to the Shulchan Aruch. But well, first I want to look again. The Taz and the Shach here, I think, play out some really interesting questions about the cultural context of this. So if you look at the Taz, I'll read this for time. It's the Taz Yud Aval Or Shuman, right? So this is about the fatty skin of the duck. אז בעשר והתר שם, בגיליון מביא דאם נחתך האור של אבוז לרצועות, בטל חשיבותו. Right, the Isser Beheter says that if the fatty skin of the duck gets cut into little strips, it's no longer chashuv. V'tamara shal sham. The Maharshal was, astonished there. Kevan she'im nechtacha ina chashuva, me'izet tzad te chashuva b'shleimuta. If when the skin is cut into sort of strips, which is how you would prepare it, it's not chashuv. How is it chashuv when it is complete, when it's in its full state? V'gam לעניות דעתי יפלא איפכא, דעיקר כיבוד באור האבוז אחר שחותכים אותו לחתיכות לתוגנם. Right? He's like, the Taz is like, and for me, this seems like the exact opposite. The main fancy thing about the fatty duck skin is that you cut it up and you fry it, right? So in its cut up state, that is its important state. That's like the chashuv way that you would serve it to people. איננו רואות שמכבדים בכל מקום בהוצאן החתיכות המתוגנות לפני אנשים חשובים. He's like, we see that important people in all these places really love their strips of fried duck skin, right? So it clearly is something that's considered chashuv. על כן, ודאי הוא חתיכה יתכבד אפילו בנפתחה, right? So he's like, certainly this is in fact, like when it's cut into strips, still חתיכה יתכבד, even if it's been chopped up. Okay. And then Kalev, can you read the Shach Yud Gimel, also Aval or Shuman Avuz?
Aval or Shuman Avuz. Maharashal Solef Bazem. Lefi de Dinam Elu Mishtanim Lefi Hamakom Vehezman. So the Maharshal disagrees about this, and the law depends upon
And he says Lefi. He says like since these rules, Mishtanim Lefi Makom Bahazman.
change based on the time and the place.
Mm-hmm.
And I forget what this is. On the Rambam, the Poskim, with the Kaman, Ras, Reish
Rosh
Siman, Ketzarti, Bezer, the Hafol, Tului, Begraot, Ene, Amorem, Im Hu Hashuv, the Hitkabed, Beoto Makom, Lob Apatil, the Im Lav Bata. ואם יש ספק, אז לינן לכולה. Okay, and so all of this depends on the way that the person sees, or I guess the person in that area, that if it is important and it can be honored in that place, then it is not batal. And if not, if it is not something that you can put in front of guests, then it is batal. And if you have a suffix, then we go based lukula.
Right. So this is the thing I think I enjoy this shaf where he's like, you know what? I'm not gonna get into the nitty-gritty, no pun intended, of like all these little animal parts and the question of which one is chashuv because the whole point is he's like, it's culturally and contextually dependent, right? So I could tell you all of the animal pieces that are important, and that just might not be true by the time that you're reading this, right? And so he's like, you should know, like the things about, oh, an animal that hasn't been slaughtered, fine. Those are going to be questions that are applicable between generations. But the question of like, what parts of the animal are chashuv is like, I could tell you that, but that doesn't actually really matter. What matters is like the person who's paskening in their time and place should know what's significant. Is this a chashuv food? And you rule based off of that. And again, we have this idea that since this whole rule is derabanan, we incline towards kula. Okay. So if we go to the next bit in our Kalev.
Is there any part of this that is dependent upon the people that you're serving it to? Because we saw the Taz talk about the Anshe Chashuvim. Like, is there a difference between like what the poor people will eat versus what you would serve people who have means?
It's a good question. I think mostly no, in the sense of like I think that he's using that as a kind of like kol shakan, right? He's like, people feed fancy people with this like fried duck skins, these fried strips of duck skin. So like certainly those are like chashuv and riayit kabed. But I think the idea is basically like more, yeah, is this a main course? Is this an important food or like a side or like a thing that like, like a chopped liver might be beloved, but is not usually considered the main star of the meal necessarily, or the main thing that you're going to be feeding your guest, right? And so I think the idea is that it's interesting because in some ways, another culturally dependent thing that we have, right, when it comes to the bishul akum, right, things cooked by non-Jews, one of the qualifications for the rules to apply to that is that it has to be ole al shulchan melachim. Only something that would go on the tables of kings fits within the rules of like stuff that could be usher if a non-Jew cooks it. And that's obviously a very nebulous category, right? Who are the kings that we're going by? There, it really is about what do the fancy people eat. But here, I think it's a bit more about like what do people value and what are sort of main courses for people. And I think the Taz is really using that as like a, and we see that the really fancy people eat this, so certainly it's chashuv. If like that would be a main thing that you serve the anashim chashuvim. So true, yes, the KFC meals really can pose a dilemma. The question of like, do we go by our current, malachim or nisiim, or do you say what's fancy food? And it's not actually based off of this current person. Okay. The next bit in the Shulchan Aruch is what we just saw at the end of the Torah, right? This idea that once the birya or chatichareit kabed is chopped up, it is batel, even after things have been mixed together. And again, that you can't do it intentionally. And the Rama, interestingly, at the end of Vav, adds a comment, De'ein chiluk ben nitzarvu b'minam u'shelo b'minam. There is no difference whether these things were mixed with their own type or not with their own type. And the Taz explains that this is sort of responding to a bit in the Isser v'Heter, where he says that if the Devar sheyesh lo matirin, which in some respects is more stringent than some of the other non-batel foods, because there we say even a suffix is aser. If that one is only eno batel bimino, then the Isser Heter says kol shekain, the other categories of things that are eno batel, it should only be when it's mixed bimino, right? And this gets back to the question we've mentioned about what are the reasons for these different things not being batel. The Taz explain, he agrees with the Rama, disagrees with Isser Heter, and he says, no, like the thing that we care about is different, right? That the one explanation the Rama gives that the Taz cites is katab b'torat chatat deshani b'davar sheyesh lematirin she'ena chashivut mitzad ha'isur atzmo elam achar sheyeh lo heter achar kach lo ratzu chachamim sheitbatel. Right? That the thing about the davar sheyesh lematirin is not about its chashivus, it's about this idea that like it's gonna become permitted, right? Be patient, just wait. And that's sort of why they're kind of machmir to not have it be batal, right? The kol shemitarev shelo b'mino ein haheter nikra al davar ha'asor ela al shem hadavar shnitarev bo. Which is an interesting concept. If something is mixed into eno mino, like if that egg got like, cracked into a lentil soup, right? I wouldn't say, oh, I have permissible egg to eat. I would say, oh, if it's able to be batel, I would say, oh, I have lentil soup. That's mutar to eat. And so this is like this kind of clever idea that like it's sort of different in that case where you're not treating the egg itself like it's the thing that has become mutar. Right? But that and the Ran says a different reason, which the Taz says is yoter nachon. I will not spoil it because I think that is going to be more relevant to our Devar Sheyesh Lematirin discussion. But the Chiluk, the Ran's explanation of why Devar Sheyesh Lematirin is only Eno Batel Bimino is one that Taz likes better. But either way, he agrees with the Ramaz comment that specification does not apply to the other categories, right? Certainly birya is like, eno batel shelo bimino. It's usually not bimino, right? And so he says the same thing here, the chatichareit kabed, even in a mixture not of its own kind, not batel. And the next bit, again, similar, we see the idea that Reuven read about if part of the pieces are cut, but not all of them, that we can't ascribe the heter to the isser to being one of the ones that's been chopped up. Rather, only the chopped up ones are permitted. And the Taz here, so we have the Taz Ein Tolin Lomar. It's the top of Memhe, if you have the book. It's Yud Dalit in the Taz. Max, can you read Ein Tolin Lomar in the Taz?
Sure. Okay. Avagav de bekol duchte tolin berov. Yoreh dehacha ikela memar adaraba kol shenishtane mikdumoso min harov hu v'have kamo kol de parish meruba kaparish v'nimtza she'eser hu hamuat lo nishtane v'hufrash mikdumoso. Okay. So even though we usually assume that um, that the piece that we cut is part of the rove. Is that what it is? The piece that
The
was chopped up?
the bechol duchte that in all places, we assume, yeah, it's he's more saying like in general, we assume that things are part of the rove, right? So the sort
Right.
of implied kashya is if the rove of pieces have been chopped up, why do we not say that the isser is part of that rove, right? Why do we assume the isser is part of the minority that is still intact,
Uh-huh.
right? And
Okay.
then,
Okay.
right, why do we say the isser is not part of the rove of chopped up pieces?
Uh-huh. Okay. Um uh okay, so but in this case, it's actually the opposite because the by cutting the piece that changes its status from what it was initially. Um and so everything that is the pari share everything that was cut from it.
The parish literally means separate. So there's this principle of kol de parish meruba parish. Anything that is separated out is assumed to be separated out from the majority. So like one of the classic examples that's given is if there's like treif nine kosher meat stores and one treif meat store in a city. We have a principle of kol kavua, anything that is fixed in its place, kamechza al mechzadami, is treated as 50-50. So if I go to a shop, I buy a piece of meat, and then I walk out and I'm like, you know what? I can't remember if that was the kosher shop or not. We treat the meat as usser. Because even though there's only one treif store, we treat it as if it's a 50-50 odds that maybe that's treif. But if I find a piece of meat lying in the market in that city, the meat has separated, as it were, and we assume that meat came from the rove of kosher stores. Right? So here he's saying the pieces that have been cut up are considered to have essentially have like separated from the original mixture. And we assume each of them came from the rove, which was the heter.
Uh-huh. Okay. And that right. And then where things land is that the Isser, right? We initially we said the Isser was part of the Rove, but here we're actually saying the Isser is assumed to be part of the minority. Um,
Right, because we assume that
yeah,
all of the pieces that were chopped up came from the rove of heter, which means the isser is assumed to continue being one of the intact pieces.
right.
But then he says then he just cites this and he says aval ein lomar.
Right. Okay. Aval ein lomar hatam de kol kavua kemechze al mechze. That's what you quoted a second ago. So we don't use that principle of coming out of one of the shops. Dekan yesh lefanecha shnei kavios, because there are two different kavua things going on here. Ha'echad hachelek hanechtach v'hasheni shenishar shelo nechtach. The piece or the first kavua is the piece of the meat that you chopped off, and the second is that there's the rest of the meat that I guess is still part of the klal. The imkain tzfei hayalomar sha'isr bechelek shenechtach. Right? It makes more sense to say that the isser is um, is in part of the piece of meat that you cut. Ki chalek zeh harov neged hakavua hasheni. Adkan. Because that piece which was cut off is um is a bigger part, a bigger piece of the meat than the other?
Right, that
The
this
piece that wasn't
kavua
cut?
is bigger than the other kavua, essentially.
The piece that was cut.
Yeah.
Not the
Or
pieces that were cut.
the pieces, the chopped up pieces are the larger group,
Ah,
or the larger kvut. And so he's like, we can't apply that principle because actually there are two kavuas. It's not one set of things being kavua that's sort of a mixture. They're kind of like two different groups that are visually and like categorically distinct. And so he's like, from that principle, we would actually say it is in the majority. So rather, it has to be what the Sharidora said of like this idea of kol de parish miruba parish. That's why we don't say the Isser is in the chopped up pieces.
uh-huh.
Okay. I will, in our very last bit, read our last theme, which are kind of funny, and then just mention a couple interesting takeaways from the Rav Ovadia. So we have Korkavan shenimtza nakuv v'nitarva ota tarnegolet im acherot medamin shuman shebekorkavan l'shuman tarnegolet shel makom chibor hakorkavan v'im domim legamre machshirim ha'acherot. If this craw got like punctured, right, which obviously means that it's a treifa, and these things are all mixed up, I can compare the sort of fatty place of that craw to where it would line up with the rest of the animal to the other pieces. And if I find one that matches it, I can say that's the other part of this treif animal, toss those out, and assume that everything else is kosher. And the next one is similar. It says, Rosh keves shnimtza treifa, v'lo noda me'eze keves hu, v'hikifo harosh litzfaro shel echad מהכבשים, ונמסו החתיכות דומות ומקוונות יפה, יש לסמוך על זה להתיר האחרות. Similarly, you find a treifa sheep head, and you kind of play like a little puzzle with all the sheep necks, and you find that it fits very neatly onto one sheep neck. It says you can say like really well. If it fits really well, then that's probably the full treif sheep, and everything else is permitted. So, in brief, for those, if anyone, I kind of highlighted, or by highlighted, I mean put in larger text, some of, I think, the most interesting takeaways from the Rev Ovadia, if people hadn't seen it in the last day or two, if you want to look through and not read the entire thing. But I think part of it was really important. For one, he goes into the rationale of why the Rif would poskin the way that he does, right? That only things that are asor bahana are not nullified. And even though, again, he explains that that's not the majority opinion, he explains why the Rif would poskin that way and posits that it can be combined, right? This principle of tseruf with some other stadim lahakel, right? Another one is that we see the Meiri and Rav Shlomo Minahar. Also, they say, this kind of goes to what Kalev mentioned. They say that a chatichar yalit kabed only applies to like the fanciest thing, right? That it's only like chatichot meshubechet umuflat b'miyuchad, like a really like a beautiful steak would be, you know, a chatichar yitkabed. But they think it's like not just about size, but really about quality, right? So according to that stance, like a just kind of normal burger is not a chatichar yitkabed, right? And so that's another sort of, even though that is also minority opinion, it's another sort of tzad lahakel, another one that he sort of joins together as potential ways of leniency. And he also points out, right, that there are lots of debates about how he poskin from the Shulchan Aruch when he brings multiple opinions, right? But he notes that like our general principle is that he says one thing stam, and then he says something else in the language of like v'yesh mivarshim v'yesh omrim, that we default to the assumption that he poskins like the stam statement, right? So even though the Shulchan Aruch, when talking about what constitutes chatichar kabed, mentioned that some people, you know, think that even full, you know, shechted, unfeathered animals are still not batel, he said stam that it's only if they're cooked, chopped pieces. And so we can assume that that's how the Machaber paskins, right? Which is obviously what is most significant for him. So he goes through and he really walks through also like what are the minhagim people have followed? Like how do we see people have like Lamaisa worked with these different principles? He also talks about the different the one thing, and this is the last thing I'll say, based off of our final CE theme, he points out a potential stira in the Shulchan Aruch, which is that if we assume that he paskins like the stam opinion he gave, right, which is that something is only realit kabed if it's like a cooked, chopped piece, the issue is in our final seifim, right? The ones about like, oh, if you have like the punctured korkovan or the treif sheep head, where it says, if you can match them up, then everything else is mutar. It seems to imply that if you can't match them up, then what? Then they be usher, right? And these are seemingly like not, these are like full animals. This is a full, sheep head or the korkovan, right? Things like that that haven't been prepared, right? Which should, according to the Stam opinion that the Mechaber brought, be nullified in a rove, in a majority, right? But he suggests that this opinion is actually only coming to teach that if you can do your little jigsaw puzzle and match up the different body parts, then all of the other ones are so mature that they can even all be cooked together at once. Whereas in other cases of Bitul Barov, we generally, even though we say it is batel, the majority of the poskim say you shouldn't cook them all together. Right? So he does this kind of clever resolution of saying it's for this kind of additional leniency that he comes to teach that. But he does think that on a fundamental level, they would be batel barov, even if you can't match up the kind of corresponding parts. Okay, shkoyach, everyone.
Shkoyach, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Very nice, Lexie.
And Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Have a